Hello and welcome to the Night Watch. Today I would like to discuss protesting. Now, as we all know, protesting in America has dominated the news recently, and for good cause. Obviously, we have a severe problem in America in which police officers are committing atrocities. And most recently, I shouldn't say most recently because there have been atrocities even since then, but very recently what dominated U.S. news as well as international news was the cold-blooded murder of Mr. George Floyd on video, with police officers acting as though it were just another day at the office, and with the criminal justice system failing to swiftly take immediate, decisive action as they would if anyone else were to murder someone on television or on video. I would expect them to be in handcuffs quite instantly within minutes or hours, and co-conspirators as well to be arrested, handcuffed, etc. quite promptly. Now, in the case of Mr. George Floyd, it seems as though in order for somewhat appropriate action to be achieved, at least charges were upgraded from murder 3 to murder 2, and accomplices were charged. But for that to happen, unfortunately, it did not happen until after massive, widespread protests took place throughout America. And why did it take so long? And why is it that it did not happen until after protests erupted throughout the country? It shouldn't require such a reaction to invoke the criminal justice system, politicians, political leaders, police authorities, commissioners, mayors, governors, and everyone else to ensure justice. It shouldn't take that long. In fact, even a rookie police officer, as one of the complicit officers is, third day on the job, graduated from the police academy in Minnesota. Obviously, I'm assuming this to be true. I don't know it to be true, but a sworn police officer with a badge and a gun must have certainly graduated from the police academy, and if so, must have been trained for a situation such as this. And if not, the whole police academy training system should be put into question. But the point of this is, in order to get justice, which we haven't really achieved yet, but we're heading in the right direction. Many of us still believe the charge should be murder 1 because there was intent. Murder 2 implies no intent. Murder 2 is as if you were enacting a very dangerous, harmful behavior repeatedly and did so without the intent to kill, but the person did die, and therefore it is a form of murder because you knew that you were inflicting this trauma on a person, but you did so without intending to kill them. So murder 2 lacks intent. It's really a problem because how can you argue there's no intent when we're talking approximately 9 minutes, we're talking about the victim, Mr. George Floyd, saying, "I can't breathe and you're killing me, you're going to kill me," and a firefighter from Minneapolis saying, "Check the pulse, you're going to kill him," and other people saying you're going to kill him, and even one of the complicit police officers who was on scene who didn't take action, at least he did say, "Should we roll him on his side?" And bottom line is, there certainly is a very clear argument that would say a reasonable person would have known that they were killing Mr. George Floyd based on the reactions physically of Mr. George Floyd, based on the visible signs, physical signs that were very clear to us on video, based on the words of Mr. Floyd, based on his weakening status and his body going limp and eventually silence, based on feedback from paramedics, I should say a firefighter on scene who certainly would be well trained in emergency first aid, including officers who are well trained in immediate first aid. So including the officer who now is inmate Chauvin, trained in first aid. Obviously, they knew they were killing Mr. George Floyd, which it means there was intent. So I am not completely satisfied with where things stand with second-degree murder, but certainly there is progress heading in the right direction with the other complicit officers being charged. There could be some more complicit that have not yet been charged. Charges could be upgraded, and we'll see where that heads. But the real point of this is it took protests to make this happen. And just as with Secretary of Defense Mark Esper on behalf of the Pentagon recently making a statement to the world and to America and to all of the men and women that defend America in the armed forces of the United States, which are represented by truly all ethnicities, all religions, and very, very much diversity within the military in America. Why did it take so long to make a statement condemning the actions of the officers who murdered Mr. George Floyd? Now, my point is the Pentagon wouldn't necessarily comment on the murder by police officers of an unarmed, restrained, helpless civilian. That would probably be outside of the military domain. But when you have National Guard troops deployed throughout America, isn't that the time that the Secretary of Defense and the Pentagon would issue a statement? Or if not, once there are threats of deploying active duty military on the streets of America, isn't that the time that the Pentagon would go on record condemning what the officers had clearly done on video and really supporting not only the cause of justice in America, but also answering to all of these servicemen and women of America who put their lives on the line to protect America domestically and internationally on standby at all times? Didn't they deserve to hear a statement from their ultimate boss, from the Pentagon, from the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Mark Esper? Why was there no statement made until after the Secretary of Defense was pulled into a scandal in which he participated in a photo op outside of the White House at which peaceful protesters were attacked by law enforcement who were in coordination, I'm assuming, with the federal government, since they shared the scene together. They were together, they were grouped together, they were coordinating together. Obviously, you had Secret Service there, you had police there, you had POTUS there, you had Secretary of Defense there, you had peaceful protesters there, and you had Secretary of Defense there as well, and claiming to not know that the police would attack the peaceful protesters with gas and everything else they used. It was really an outright assault on peaceful protesters for the sake of a photo op. So only after the Secretary of Defense was implicated in the scandal of why didn't he know this would happen, why didn't he prevent it or try to prevent it or not participate in it, that is when the Pentagon went on record and Mr. Mark Esper spoke. And I congratulate and applaud the speech that he gave to America and all of the service women and men that defend the country every day of their lives, as well as the veterans who have served, and on behalf of all those that have been lost fighting for the freedoms that we all enjoy in America today. So many lives have been lost. So it was very important that the Pentagon went on record with that position, and I applaud that. And I know that that was going against the grain of kind of the party line for Mr. Mark Esper to give that speech, which was very important and it's commendable that it was given. It's just too bad that it did not happen until the Secretary of Defense was pulled into the scandal of participating in that photo op in which peaceful protesters were attacked, and all of the protests and the outcry from all across America based on everything that led up to that, including that. And so I would just say it's great, but it's too little too late. So really the point of this discussion I want to make is, unfortunately, it takes protests to inspire change in America. Having police officers murdering unarmed, restrained civilians on video doesn't seem to influence any change at all. Having lawsuits filed and huge settlements paid doesn't seem to influence any positive change in America at all. Having widespread mass protests seems to influence positive change in America and reform. That's what it seems to take, which means the system's broken. Having murderous cops on video killing people as they killed Mr. George Floyd does not seem to influence positive change. This is not the first time this has happened. As we all know, it's been happening for a very long time. I recall the case of Rodney King long ago in Los Angeles, California, when he was horribly beaten and assaulted by officers on video, and really nothing happened until widespread massive protests, which led to violence and looting and fires and horrible things. And ultimately that did influence some change, but as we've seen, it wasn't very long lasting. And I sure hope change now will be long lasting. So this is the point I want to make about protesting. It's very easy to sit back and armchair quarterback things and say, well, peaceful protesting is good, and that's what must happen, peaceful protesting, and that is really what's needed. And I agree with that. The problem is when you have mass peaceful protests, when you have the masses protesting, there's always going to be someone in the group that throws a rock or throws something that's ignited on fire and throws it and starts a fire. There's always going to be people that get out of control and do things that they shouldn't do. And someone's going to throw a rock amongst the crowd. Someone's going to throw a rock back. Things are going to escalate. So the challenge is I really haven't seen any widespread massive national protests that were able to remain entirely peaceful throughout. When you reach the point in society where the only way to influence positive change is for massive, widespread national protests everywhere to happen, that is inevitably going to result in fires, in damage to property, in violence and looting. It's always happened as far as I can remember historically, and it probably always will. It's the fault of the system that it's broken and that it won't listen to simple integrity and what's right or wrong and watch the video we all watched on the murder of Mr. George Floyd. It's not enough to change the system. It takes protesters. The fact that the system requires widespread massive protests to actually seek meaningful change means the system is forcing American citizens into a position to participate in such protests in which there inevitably always will be looting and violence and fires. That's just what happens in protests. So America, politicians, law enforcement, commissioners, mayors, governors, senators, everyone, if you don't want protests and the resulting undesirable outcomes that brings, such as loss of property, even loss of life and horrible injuries, then don't put America in a position where America has to protest. And truly, it seems like the reason for the positive change that comes out of protests, it's not to do what's right or wrong, it's self-preservation by politicians and high-level officials and commissioners and governors and mayors and senators and so on wanting to be reelected and realizing, wow, look at all the different people protesting. That's representative of all ethnicities and religions. And that's our voting base. And if we don't do something, we're not going to win the next election. So it's time for change. We have to put politicians in a position where they realize they're going to lose the election if they don't do something, and then they do something. Or they're going to lose their job unless they do something, police chiefs and commissioners and so on, and then they do something. Why put us in the position where we must protest in order to influence positive change? The system should be able to do this independently without requiring protests. And as we saw, until there were protests, there was not acceptable outcomes. It's probably not over yet. If any of these officers make bail, that's going to erupt quite a bit of chaos. Why do they even have offenses that are bailable? They certainly should be non-bailable in my opinion. And the other question is, will there be convictions or not? And there are just all these issues that could lead to more protests. So it is the time for change. And there have been some officials, some politicians that have been making genuine efforts to influence positive change. They probably realize they won't be reelected if they don't. Some of them might be doing so for the right reasons. There are certainly good politicians out there as well. But the ultimate point in closing that I want to make is that violence, loss of life, injuries, looting, burning down buildings is bad. We know that. Peaceful protesting is part of America. And that's a good thing. And that's how people are able to put everything on the line and fight for positive change in a peaceful fight that does not involve violence. However, we must realize, and America must realize, and politicians and authorities must realize, that whenever you have massive protests, there will be collateral damage. That's just going to happen. Now, unfortunately, throughout these protests, police continue to exert unreasonable, unjustified, excessive force. As we saw recently in Buffalo, police officers shoved a 75-year-old elderly white man backwards. He landed and horribly injured his head. It was a horrible injury, and he was hospitalized and not able to communicate to make a statement because of how bad the injury was. And we all saw in the video how bad it was. Police immediately filed a report, which was completely inaccurate, which after the video continued to circulate, only then was the report modified to be more accurate. I don't know how accurate it even is still, but it seems like law enforcement has this default go-to pattern of write a report that exonerates all officers without regard for reality, and if there's proof in a video, well, then you got to edit the report to make it match the video. But do we ever get to a point where the report actually is worse than the video? Because these officers are wearing body cams, and what was said and done and everything else probably goes deeper than the video. But I don't think the reports come out making things look worse than the video. The best case scenario is things look as bad as the video, but no worse. Even in the case of Mr. George Floyd, where is that body cam footage? What else was said by these officers? I haven't seen it. Have you? So far, it's just the video from bystanders and others. We haven't seen that body cam video and heard that body cam audio. And there are other cases, a police vehicle drove into protesters. And what I also heard recently, I'm not sure if this is true, but in Buffalo, those two officers were suspended immediately without pay, which is certainly a good step. They should, of course, go through what anyone else would when you push an elderly man down and he cracks his head and is hospitalized. That seems to be a felony level of assault. At least if the average person were to walk up to a 75-year-old man and push him over and he fell down and horribly injured his head and was bleeding and hospitalized, that would be a felony level assault, and that would lead to an immediate arrest. Of course, the police aren't arrested. As far as I know, they're not yet charged. At least they were suspended without pay. But apparently, and I might have misread this news headline, it seems that other officers in Buffalo actually were resigning to protest the suspension of those officers, which, if that is true, wow, let's get rid of those officers that are taking a stand on defending the officers that were suspended for pushing down the elderly man. So was there swifter justice for the elderly white man pushed over than for Mr. George Floyd? I'm not sure. In both cases, it's unacceptable. In both cases, it's horrible. It should have never happened. But at this point, in closing, we need to obviously clean up America, clean up the criminal justice system. We need a self-policing system that doesn't require protesters to protest, that doesn't require the necessity of nationwide and even global protests to erupt. We should have a system that when something evil and dark and sinister has happened, the system takes care of it without the need for everybody to go and march and protest. That shouldn't be necessary. Unfortunately, as we've recently seen, it is. And if ever in the future we have troops deployed throughout America, whether it be National Guard or under threats of deploying active duty military, the Pentagon should go on record when the time is right, not once the Pentagon is pulled into a scandal and goes on record because they have to. That's it for this episode. We do not want to see violent protests and buildings on fire and looting, but we all know when there are mass protests historically, that is a consequence of protest. It's uncontrollable. There is no manager of the protests walking around with a checklist and a clipboard and a bullhorn with organized groups and able to tell people, don't throw that rock, don't throw that fire. When we're dealing with the masses, it's people exerting their individual will, fighting for what they believe is right in the way that they know how, and some people take it too far. And how can anyone control that? And is it fair to gas everybody and flashbang grenade everybody and fire rubber bullets at everybody? I mean, the truth is, the reason for the protest is the fault of the police officers who committed and were complicit in the murder of Mr. George Floyd, as well as the police department, as well as the city, as well as the state, as well as probably that police academy, and everyone, including commissioners, including whatever brass is involved in the process of allowing people like inmate Chauvin to continue to operate like this, and some of the others that also have a trail of carnage in their past in law enforcement, all that allowed them to continue in their positions, that covered for them, and that allowed that culture. Let's send them the bill for the mass loss of property and damages and burnt buildings and injuries and even fatalities. Ultimately, they're the ones that put us in the position where the only recourse was protest. Let's send them the bill. Let's send the bill to the Minneapolis Police Department, to inmate Chauvin and his co-conspirators, to the city of Minneapolis, the state of Minnesota. Let's let them pay back this damage, because ultimately, in the end, it's their fault this all happened. Thank you for joining this episode of The Night Watch.